And we're recording.
Great. Welcome to today's episode of GIS 101. We are here with Jonathan Duran, who is the Deputy Director of the Arkansas GIS Office and a NSGIC board member as well. And he is going to speak with us today about addresses and looking at geospatial address data, why it's critical for a variety of real-world applications. Jonathan, thank you so much for being here with us today, and I'll let you just take it away.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you for everyone who will be joining and listening. As Molly mentioned, we're going to take a fairly high-level look at address data. There's several different rabbit holes we could go down if we wanted to. However, I wanted to focus this primarily on how we use the data and why it's really important, rather than getting into a lot of the nuts and bolts of the data itself, databases and things like that. So, moving right along, this first slide may seem very rudimentary, but I sort of wanted to take the approach of building the idea, of what is an address. We, from a GIS perspective, we tend to think very narrowly about what an address is. But if we just kind of step back from that just for a second and really look at an address and what it is at a very fundamental level, it's essentially a means to articulate or identify where something is, a location. That could be obviously physical or virtual. In the GIS world, we tend to focus more on that physical location. And there's always some level of specificity with that address. Some common examples that we're all familiar with, your email address, an IP address. And I will say that if anyone later tries to go to that IP address, I have no idea what it might or might not go to. That was just one I simply made up. It's actually the time that I was doing this slide on January 9th of this year. The old, familiar snail mail address, in this case a post office box, or the one we're probably more familiar with being the physical address. And just incidentally, that happens to be the street address for the state capitol building here in Little Rock. What else? So in addition to your social security number, your address is probably the most basic and fundamental piece of information that any government entity has or collects about you. And if you think about it, if you go into any type of government office, they're going to ask you one or both of those things, your social security number and your address. It's on your driver's license. It's on your voter registration. It's on your property tax assessment. 911 has or should have your address, and all those tend to be governmental functions at some level. So now let's move a little more specifically and start looking at the elements of geospatial address data. And there are some things that, to really be geospatial data, there's a few things you just really have to have. One's obviously the street address, 500 Wood Lane Street. The city, the state, and the zip code. And then thirdly, my third must-have are coordinates. To be geospatial data, you've got to know where it is on the surface of the earth. Now, moving beyond those are, like I said, those three are the must-haves. Because if you take away any part of that, there's probably a 100 Main Street in every little town in the country. If you take away other parts of that, it becomes very generic or fuzzy. And then, of course, with coordinates could be for a tree or a rock, and those types of things generally don't have an address. But moving beyond those, some things that maybe aren't necessarily absolutely necessary, but are really good to have. One is a subaddress, and these are your standard, apartment 101, suite, lot. There's the whole long list of those standard unit types. And in some of the research I did for this, slip is actually a standard unit type from the U.S. Postal Service. I suppose if you're living in a houseboat and it's parked at a marina and you get your mail there, then your address would be slip 7 or whatever. Source. And I did separate source and authority because oftentimes those two things may not necessarily be the same. In the state of Arkansas, and as in many other states, we have downloadable address data. If you downloaded that address data for a certain county from us, we would be the source. We're not the authority because we're not the ones that actually assigned those addresses or created that data originally. At the state level, we just aggregated that data and make it available for download. And then lastly, type becomes very, very important. Obviously, as just a quick example, a residential type of address would be very important to the U.S. Census Bureau because that's where you live. People typically aren't living at a bank, a government building, or any number of other things that could be in one of these categories. And so making that leap to something more visual, this is really what you want to see. Obviously you've got street data, you've got address point data on the roofs of each building. I say of each building, if you may notice there is one fairly large building that for whatever reason, in this case, this happens to be in a county in Arkansas, and for whatever reason, that large building at the lower right does not have an address point. I noticed that earlier, and quite honestly, I'm not sure why. But normally it should. But you see each structure is identified, each structure has a number, and again, this is really what you want to see. So, why is this data important? And this is really where we're going to spend the rest of this session, because I wanted to focus on what we can do with the data, why it's important. We certainly will not explore every use of every potential use or application, but from our standpoint, especially a governmental standpoint, each one of these things you see listed here become very important. Obviously, I put 911 and emergency response first because if you're in that situation where you're having to dial 911, you don't want it to be hard for those folks to find you, whether that's, law enforcement, ambulance, fire truck, whatever. And again, as I mentioned, as you see, several of these things are governmental related types of things. And that's why I said that's your address is one of the most fundamental pieces of information that a government entity has about you. And as you look at these, each one of these, or most of these, involve some type of area or polygon. If you're thinking in a mapping or GIS sense, most of these can be represented by some area, an election precinct, a school district, a taxing entity, etc. So if we dig a little bit farther into these, from a 911 perspective, you want this person to have your address, know what your address is, be able to find your address. Because if you're in the unfortunate maybe situation that you're dialing 911 because something is wrong, you definitely want this dispatcher to be able to get your information and get the folks in these vehicles to you as quickly as possible. Now, I've had conversations with folks before, and the reaction was, well, I don't want them to know what my address is. Speaking of the county or whoever the entity was that it was assigning those addresses, and my counter to that has always been, well, if you're out there and you cut your leg off, how difficult do you want it to be for the ambulance to find you? Because if they don't know where you are and where your address is, that's a real life scenario. This graphic I picked up a few years ago, but it really captures that sentiment. You may know where you are, and God may know where you are, but if dispatch doesn't know where you are, you and God better be on real good terms, because it's, who knows what's going to happen in that situation if that was real. So let's change gears just a little bit. Think about floodplain management. Now, obviously, this graphic should be very familiar to most of us, probably. The blue being the 100-year or 1% annual chance flood zone in this particular area, and in the background also aerial imagery and parcel data. And let's imagine for a second that those blue areas actually flooded, up to the edge of that. Well, it becomes a very easy query to say, okay, which parcels are associated with this flooding. That's good, but then there's also more to that story, because at this point you don't necessarily have a good sense maybe of what structures are in those parcels, if there are structures in those parcels, or what's really going on out there in the ground. And obviously with the parcel data we have extensive databases, and we can get things like valuation, owner, etc. However, from time to time, parcel data may not have the actual physical address of that place, if for no other reason that there may not be anything addressed on that structure, or oftentimes what's most important to the tax assessor is who owns that parcel. Maybe not necessarily the address of the structure on that parcel, because they're more concerned with who gets the tax bill. So then if we add address data to this, things start to become a lot clearer. You see all the address points there in the small blue dots, with the larger pink dots being the addresses that are associated with the parcels that were affected by the flooding, or the imaginary flooding, if you will. And then you can see that there are several parcels in here that just do not have structures on them. Maybe they're undeveloped, who knows what. Or on the right-hand side of the screen, maybe they're just timbered acreage or something like that. And then, of course, with the address data, you really get into that that specific structure address, and possibly even depending on the comprehensiveness of the address data, maybe even who lives there. But now you can really start to get a sense of a lot more specifics in this type of information. So thinking about emergency management, we think about the typical things of flooding or tornadoes or hurricanes or anything like that. And in the unfortunate event that one of those things occurs, this type of information can become very, very valuable, because in a very real sense, if you think about before and after, this picture might represent the before, and this picture might represent the after. Now, this obviously is very catastrophic tornado damage, and who knows what was where and who was where when all you're left with is piles of debris such as this. So that again, that address data gives you a sense and almost an inventory of what was there, and then being able to go out after the fact in emergency response and really start, whether that be search and rescue, recovery, whatever it might be. Same thing with flooding. In this particular picture, obviously these are mobile homes, and in this type of flooding, you can imagine that mobile homes will and do move. I mean, I don't think it's a stretch to see that having a record of where those were via address data could also become very, very vital. Continuing with this idea, excuse me, of use cases, we'll take a look at election administration right quick. So this particular area, now what you see here in Arkansas, we took the entire statewide voter registration database and geocoded it. This area is a particular town in Arkansas. It's a very small town. The population is 12 to 1,300. And the dots you see are color-coded by precinct name. And then the areas you see shaded are also the corresponding actual precincts. So in this case, the red line is a municipal boundary, and within that municipal boundary is an individual election precinct. Well, as you look at this one looks pretty good. We've got a few outliers in there. For the most part, though, those purple dots are all within that red boundary where they should be. Like I said, there's a few outliers here and there. But the take-home message here is those outliers you don't really get a sense of where they are or even that they're there unless you can look at this data in this form. Whereas before, just in maybe a voter registration database, kind of a flat file of here's a name, here's an address, and here's a precinct. Well, does that address and that precinct really match up? Well, until we can look at it like this, we might not know. But again, this one's a fairly decent example of some clean data. So if you're going to have issues with this type of data, it's probably going to come from one of two sources. In this case, you see this is a county in Arkansas, and the surrounding counties you see a lot of dots. And the county right in the middle is pretty sparse. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with this county having a low population. It has everything to do with the fact that there are some issues with this particular county's address data, and the geocode didn't work well. This county itself has, I don't know, a population of 10 to 12,000, and I'm not sure exactly how many dots are within that county, but it's far fewer than 10 to 12,000. And so that data quality plays a really important role. The other problem you might experience that is really going to be borne out by this type of analysis, this type of geocode, is problems in the actual precinct data. So there's two things we see here. On the left-hand side, you see the intermingling of the green dots and kind of those purple dots. And you should also notice that those are fairly formed up and form some very visible patterns. We don't know for sure what's going on there. However, it's very likely that perhaps there was a precinct split that actually occurred that has not been made in the polygon data. So in that case, the voter registration database might be more up to date than the pre-existing spatial data. The other side of that is on the right-hand side of the screen. You see all those orange dots that lie on both sides of that gray line, and the shading is pretty close, but you can see the difference in the shading. Again, we don't know for sure, but what this might lead us to believe is that those two precincts were combined, and again, the polygon data might not be as up to date as it needs to be. But again, just to reiterate, those types of things really don't start to jump out at you until you can put these in a spatial context. Moving along into public health, what I've got here is I'm going to give you an example of some work we did in Arkansas a few years ago. This had to do with an outbreak of avian influenza, more specifically associated with poultry. So March 6, 2015, an instance of avian influenza was detected on a poultry farm in Boone County, Arkansas. Now, without going through each step, if you jump down to March 13th, over the course of a week, we were able to, our State Livestock and Poultry Commission contacted us, and over the course of a week, we were able to provide them a web application with online entry, because what they had to do, what their inspectors had to do, was go into this area. Here's the infected farm, and within a 5-kilometer radius, they had to go to every address, every house, and determine if this house had any type of poultry. If they did, wasn't infected, because they had to know how far or how fast it had spread, so they knew so they could formulate their containment strategy. And so here's some examples of some of the products that we were able to give them. This, you see an area in this particular county, in the red arc, that was the edge of that, I believe it was a 5-kilometer radius. And so each dot is an address, and so what those inspectors had to do was check each and every address within that quarantine zone. This was an example of the form we were able to put together. And as you can see there in the middle, when I said poultry, most of the time we think of, chicken farms, chicken houses, but that also included turkeys, ducks, geese, and other birds that people might keep as pets or whatever. And so because we had that data, we were able to do, mail merge type of thing, produce these standard forms for the inspectors to use. And then ultimately we had an online map that they were able to access on their tablets as they went from each place to place, surveying and testing and all the other things they did. And as they went through, they could, essentially check off these addresses, whether they were positive, negative. And then each day, their folks back here in Little Rock, which this particular area is about 2.5 hours from Little Rock, the folks with the Livestock and Poultry Commission back here could see the progress and see what was going on a daily basis. So why did this work? One, we had the data. We had spent a lot of time and a lot of effort helping our individual counties build this data. So without the data up front, we couldn't have done it. Number two, that data is not locked down. Technically anybody in the world can download our data. Our address data is not, we have no limitations. There's no statutory or other limitations on just the address data itself. And just to add to that, the address data that's downloadable from us does not contain any personal information. It's just strictly that address. And from a coordination standpoint, we in the agency here, we'd spent a lot of time communicating with other agencies and just letting them know that that data is there and the types of things that they could do with it. And that's why, on that day, our Livestock and Poultry Commission contacted us and say, okay, let's see what we can do. And, obviously it worked. It worked very well. Sales tax, sales tax is a big thing as well. The issue, what I call the Amazon effect, or online retailers. And prior to June 21st of 2018, if you ordered something from an online retailer, they may or may not add that sales tax. Well, that effectively changed with this Supreme Court decision. And now, when I order something from Amazon, my specific sales tax is determined by what those individual rates are in the city and county where I live. Obviously, the state rate is the same across the board, but and that does change from depending on the county and city. Having that address point located where it really is to the house is very important because there are some flaws with assigning sales tax jurisdiction in other ways. If you just say, well, I live in Benton, Arkansas, and the sales tax rate is this, well, that creates a problem in some areas because not every city in Arkansas, and I assume this is the case in probably other states and other places, not every city in Arkansas has a zip code. And that's simply because maybe it's a small town and there is no post office within that city. And in that case, and you'll see this illustrated in a couple of slides, but in that case, the address of the city that I write on an envelope if I mail something may not be the city in which I actually live within those incorporated limits. There's some flaws with zip codes as well because zip code, a single city could contain multiple zip codes, and that zip code can be both inside and outside of the city, just depending on how those mail routes run. And so through all that, really the only practical method is the geolocation of addresses and getting that pinpointed to where it really is. So this next series of graphics will really illustrate this. This is an area in Arkansas, northwest Arkansas, where these cities are all adjacent. It's a heavily incorporated area, and you see they're right next to each other with little to no gaps between the cities. And also in this case, Springdale, the city in purple, and Elm Springs span that county line in green, so they actually fall into counties. So stepping through this, the red lines here are zip codes. Now, one little thing I'll say here is that we tend to represent zip codes as polygons as a matter of convenience, but in actuality, zip codes aren't polygons. Zip codes are routes. It's all about how mail is delivered. There are instances where I could show you where these routes actually overlap. And so you can have two houses, one right across the road from another, directly across, that have different zip codes. And that's just a function of where their mail is coming from. And so as we move forward, we add zip plus 4 points. Well, each zip plus 4 that you'd see in an address represents a certain segment of a delivery route. So now you can start to see some spillover in those zip code polygons. On sort of the right side middle, you see those orange and green dots, and the orange dots spill over the red line, which more than likely that zip code line there, to be truly accurate, might need to be adjusted a little bit to the east. So if we keep going and then stick in the address points, you really start to see the true picture. And one thing I'll point out, you can see the zip codes in black text there. That 72762 zip code is technically the Springdale zip code. That zip code also covers the city of Elm Springs that you can see there on the left. So in this case, the address point that the arrow is pointing to there is actually within the city of Springdale, and its physical address has a Springdale zip code. Contrast that against the address point indicated here, which is within the incorporated limits of Elm Springs, but still has the Springdale zip code. So now you can maybe start to see why zip code itself maybe isn't the best thing for sales tax assignment, because in this case, both of those addresses, both those dots that were indicated, have the same mailing zip code. And you know, these cities like this are extremely serious about making sure that any and all sales tax revenue that should be coming to them actually does indeed come to them. This map shows all the sales tax rates in Arkansas, and I put this in just to kind of give an indication of the complexity of that, because obviously it's difficult to see, but suffice it to say that everywhere you see a label is a different sales tax rate. And so there are 75 counties in Arkansas, 501 cities, you know, sort of do the math. All right, moving along. This one is an example of a project that was actually brought to us directly from the governor at the time. As you can see, back in 2012, Governor Mike Beebe commissioned a mapping project from the agency, and he wanted to understand some of the things about Medicaid. And of course, at this time, this was a really, really big deal, because this was Medicaid expansion, the time frame of Medicaid expansion, the Affordable Care Act, and you know, a lot of those things were going on. And because obviously we're dealing with elected officials, one of the things that was really important to see was these results by legislative districts, by our state House and Senate districts. So each one of these little black dots on this map represents an individual Medicaid client. What we were able to do is take that database, geocode those primarily to the address points, and then there's a lot of things that really start to become available, a lot of information that you might not have had before without doing this. So what you see here is number of Medicaid clients, and this just kind of gives you an idea of concentration of people and where they were. The darker blues being more concentrated or higher numbers. Same thing with payments made to client payments by the Senate district. And this starts to, if you cross-reference this with then other information, it really starts to tell you a lot more. Again, this level of detail wouldn't have been possible without that address data. And just a third example, this kind of flips the table there, and these were claims by the actual providers. Again, you can see the highest concentrations by the darker colors. So again, this was something extremely important to our governor at the time and our legislature at the time. Within the state of Arkansas, this is really sort of our dream, and we're slowly working toward this, but our dream is to have this robust address database that then becomes a resource for all the other agencies. And this is obviously not every state agency, but these were some of the big ones that we knew could make immediate use of the data in various ways. And AMAP there in the middle is the Arkansas Master Address Program. We didn't want to say Arkansas Master Address Database because that would have just been AMAD. And yeah, probably not the best, probably a better choice is probably AMAP. So kind of taking a different direction now that we've reviewed several different uses and applications, it's important to understand what the challenges are in working with and dealing with address data. One of the most basic ones is simply naming conventions in your addresses. Is it First Street with a numeral 1, or is it spelled out F-I-R-S-T? I mean, those are essentially the same thing, but when it comes to addressing, those naming conventions become very important. You know, for a county road, there's the county road name, or, you know, do you use the words county road? And those are specific cases within Arkansas because there's those different naming conventions. Same thing with a highway. Is this Highway 79 or is this US 79 highway? Doesn't seem like a big deal until you start geocoding. In Arkansas, I've often said that we have 75 counties and about 30 different ways physical addressing is done. And so, as you can imagine, that creates its own unique challenges. And one of the unfortunate things that we have to deal with in Arkansas is that as over the years, and back several years ago when the conversions first started happening from the old route and box style rural addressing to actual physical addressing, there was no standard about how to do those addressing. This was really back before the days when GIS what it is now. And so this wouldn't have necessarily been a data standard. It would have more would have been sort of a best practice or a standard of how to actually assign an address. And so there's things that have come through over the years that you just sort of bad ways of doing things, so to speak. And oftentimes what happens is personnel turnover, and things might get done a little bit differently from person to person. The next one, what I've termed as Google as the gospel. I'll say that this is in no way meant to disparage Google or Google Maps at all. I use Google Maps all the time. It's a wonderful resource. However, oftentimes people look at it as absolute, that it's absolutely correct, that it's the gospel truth, and it's not. Google Maps often has errors, and when those errors happen, they tend to, the residents out in Arkansas tend to call us and say, Google, FedEx can't find me, or I type in my address into Google and it puts me in the next town, or something like that. Vanity addressing. Everybody likes to name their driveway. That can create its own challenges as well. Roads with no names. I know that kind of seems like an odd thing, but there was an article I read recently, and it had to do with roads on Native American reservation lands. A lot of roads out there have no names, yet things still need to be locatable for a variety of reasons. And so this idea of plus codes, and there's an example of one. This was a way to identify a location on a road that just didn't have a name. And also, we see a lot of challenges with, I just mentioned that conversion from, the old route and box style addressing to actual physical addresses. And obviously there can be some challenges there because one type of address is meant to be locatable along a road. The former is just meant to identify a mailbox, which may or may not be at a house. So let's go through a few of these. The honest truth is, working with address data, maybe as you could see from that list, yeah, there is often the good, the bad, and the ugly of those types of things. So one example about just data accuracy, you see here, this is some rural centerline data from Arkansas. A highway running through the middle, a private road, and a county road, Calhoun 419. So the problem then results from this. What you saw as labeled as Calhoun 419 on the previous slide was actually the power line right-of-way you see in the top picture. The bottom picture with the sign that says Calhoun 419 was what was identified in the data as the private road. Now I'll back up to that. Again, this creates a lot of issues, not the least of which, as you can see, this is a very rural, very remote looking area. Just imagine you are driving an ambulance in the dark through this wooded area, and your map shows you where Calhoun 419 is, which is wrong because of the way this data is mislabeled. So there's a lot going on in this slide. In Arkansas, as I assume in probably some other states, road centerline data existed before address data. Not the addresses themselves, but the actual address point data. And in the absence of address point data to use as ground truth, and without someone actually going and driving every street you see, or every street in a town, oftentimes what happened is the left and right address ranges were input to match postal ranges, which run in blocks of 100. Well, the issue there is that the actual addressing on one of these streets, if you look at the street to the left, you see those green dots, which are the geocoded points, bunching up on one end of the street, and then the red dots are the actual verified address points. The reason those bunch up is because in the geocode, if this street here, this particular street, if the left and right address ranges that were input were done as 200 to 299, the actual on-the-ground addressing might only be 200 to 230. And so it forces those all to bunch up. In this case, the correction that needs to be made is those left and right address ranges need to be adjusted to match reality. The one in the center you see there has got two things going on. One, that same bunching up, but also you see a left and right, or odd and even issue going on there. You see those green lines crossing over each other. And in this particular example, those green lines connect, say, the geocoded point for 100 Main Street to the actual verified address point for 100 Main Street, or whatever that street might happen to be. And this is just an example of a tool we use in our office to identify these types of things, an analysis tool we use. Here's another example. This one, you see some areas where these the address points are spaced out like you might expect to see them, but also in that center cul-de-sac, you also see that same bunching up of those address points. And these are things that, unless you go through your straight centerline data very closely and compare the left and right ranges to the addresses, you're probably not going to see this unless you can run an analysis like this to start pointing these out. The example, and I mentioned Google as the gospel, and this is an example that we got a call on just a couple months ago probably. So the address to pay attention to here is, you see out on the left or the west side there, that house and that address sitting out by itself with a number 2 on it. That address is actually 2 Drew Drive, and you see Drew Drive as kind of a short segment there in the lower central area. So the call we got, and I'll back up, is that it was either FedEx or UPS could not find number 2 Drew Drive. And it happened to be that the problem was that whoever it was using, I believe, Google Maps to locate them. All right, so if you did a search for 2 Drew Drive, this is where Google Maps puts that address. And in this particular area, you see the shadows in the trees. That happens to be a fairly steep hillside. And if we move along, of course, that's the actual house that has that address. And then if you do, routing like you can, this is what the result is. And so this is most likely what someone driving a delivery truck was seeing, and this is what was creating the problem, how they couldn't find them. In a real sense, where the application routed them to was about 1,000 feet away. Not necessarily a great distance when it comes to, going from point A to point B. One of the issues that we oftentimes have to work out when it comes to things like this is, well, okay, someone can't find an address by whatever means, and one of my first questions is, well, is there appropriate signage? And in this case, there was. Now, if we back up, if you can see there, let me back up a couple slides. You can see it better. Okay, so coming off the highway, if I was going to drive to Drew Drive, I would first turn off onto Sky Hill Drive and then turn off onto Drew Drive. So if we go back forward, this is straight out of Google Maps Street View. You can see that Sky Hill Drive is appropriately signed. So no issue there. And then the Street View imagery was not quite good enough here. The car did not drive all the way up that street, but in the red circle there is a green sign, standard issue street sign, and I would just about be willing to bet money that it says Drew Drive on that green sign. So in this case, the only obstacle between this resident and them receiving their delivery, whatever it was the fact that when you input this into something like Google Maps or whatever, it took them to the wrong place. So again, the point there is there's accurate address data, but don't necessarily rely on one source to get you to that address. And I mentioned vanity addressing. This particular house, everybody likes to have their personalized driveway, which can create issues, not the least of which is when a driveway is named after the resident. What happens when that resident leaves and the next one is, their name is not Bolin, and they want to change it? Well, yeah, you can imagine the issues created there. So in this case, the resident's name is Bolin, B-O-W-L-I-N. This is essentially their driveway, and their address is number 3 Bolin Lane. Now, somewhat humorous. This is an area I happen to know the resident, and jokingly they said, well, we first wanted to name it Bolin Alley, but we decided to go with Bolin Lane. And I just kind of shook my head. Okay. Again, there's the close-up. And incidentally, neither is that yellow sign a standard issue county road sign. This example is now we're really getting into the topic of address conversion. So this is a typical scene in many places where you have about, I think I counted up maybe 10 mailboxes there. So each one of those mailboxes obviously corresponds to a resident and to a house somewhere along this county road there that you see turning off the highway. The Problem is, that's well and good to deliver mail, but that falls somewhat short in a sense of any of those types of applications we discussed, whether it be emergency management, 911, whatever it might be. Here's another example when the addresses are maintained on these types of printouts, and this is a real example with those handwritten corrections. Where how do I really find these residents? Same thing here. You see the old style route and box type address. Well, it's easy to get mail to those boxes, but where in the world are those residents located? Well, in a real sense, those mailboxes are in that yellow circle you see at the lower right. And if you see look at this inset, just above that T intersection, there's a dark spot with a shadow. That's those actual mailboxes. And those 4 or 5 mailboxes correspond to the address points that you see out to the northwest. And in this particular case, this is in an area that's, as you can see, pretty rugged territory, very rural. So you can imagine the difficulty that might be had in actually locating these residents, these houses, without this address point data. And just to kind of wrap up here, one of the things that I have learned in my years of working with address data and various other local data sets is you got to have some flexibility. You got to be able to roll with stuff. Like the slide says, blessed are the flexible, for they shall not be bent out of shape. And with that, I certainly thank you for your time, and I would entertain any questions that we might have.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. This has been really interesting. I do have a question that I would be interested to hear your thoughts on, and that's around privacy and how that works in terms of address data.
Well, I mean, obviously there can be a lot of private and or personally identifiable information associated with an address itself. The address by itself is not necessarily private information. When we did some of those analysis type things, as like I saw with the Medicaid stuff, we had those addresses, we had numbers, we didn't have names, and so a lot of that stuff can still be done. But the take-home message is that I'd say this: if anyone thinks their address is private, then how did you get all those political mailers that we're all getting in the mail right now?
That's fair. That's fair. Okay. Any other questions from anybody?
Yeah, I was wondering how the address numbers get assigned.
Generally speaking, that address number is calculated based on first a distance from some point of origin. Let's take a particular county road, for instance, and someplace out there's a point where that county road starts. Maybe it's an intersection with a highway, and there's a measurement taken from that origin to typically in rural addressing, typically to the driveway. So that's 1.7 miles from the intersection with the highway to that driveway. Then usually how that works is that, and it tends to be different with each jurisdiction, but we'll say for ease of numbers, we'll say there's 1,000 addresses per mile, and that's typically set by county ordinance. Now, if there's 1,000 addresses per mile, that means every 5.28 feet is another potential address. So I'll change my numbers to, let's say that driveway was 1 mile from the point of origin or the intersection with the highway. 5,280 feet, 5.28 feet per address. Do the quick math, and then that address becomes 1,000. Now those numbers are easy, but that gives you the concept, the general concept of how that linear addressing works. You know, that simple division based on an established interval, in this case 5.28, because it was set at 1,000 addresses per mile, and the total distance to that house or to that structure, you know, of course, and divided by that interval. And then that would be the most typical way to do it, but there can be 100 different wrinkles on how a particular jurisdiction might actually assign or calculate their numbers.
Okay, and then maybe if we've got time for just one more, I know that you talked a little bit, or maybe more than a little bit, about Google as gospel. I'm wondering, you know, if you mentioned that you get some calls, and you know, I'm wondering if you know, if I've lived in my house for a decade and Google Maps can't find me, you know, why is that, and how would I get that fixed? What would the process be?
Well, and there's different ways that can be done, and those corrections can actually be submitted through you know, the Google Maps website. You know, there's usually a link at the bottom that's off the top of my head, I can't remember what the link says, but you can suggest corrections. We also try as much as possible to feed that information to, you know, whether it be Google or TomTom or any of other providers like that. However, oftentimes we can't necessarily influence how often you know, they might update those data sets. So the bottom line is there's probably not a really good answer to that question, but you know, we try to work all the angles we can.
Okay, very good. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing your expertise as part of the GIS 101 series. This is a series that NSGIC put together to present a non-technical overview of topics within GIS as a tool for our members and others to use with all of the people we deal with who may not have a working knowledge of GIS topics, who could benefit from learning more. We record these webinars and archive them on our website, and would invite anyone who's listening to check out the other webinars in the series, and we continue to record them on an ongoing basis. So, Jonathan, thanks so much for being with us and sharing your knowledge and insights and being part of the series.
Thank you very much.
All right, bye-bye.